The dining room glittered under the chandelier, silverware clinking against china as laughter swirled through the air. My siblings passed wine around. My cousins dug into their plates, and the smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon rolls filled every corner. Then my father's voice cut through it all. He slammed his fork down, the sound sharp as a gunshot. "Enough," he said, his face flushed with red. Then, with a smile that wasn't kind but triumphant, he announced to the whole table, "You're a leech. You can't stay here anymore." The room went silent. My hands froze on the napkin in my lap. Every eye turned toward me, some wide with pity, others with smirks they tried to hide. My dad leaned back in his chair, satisfied, certain he'd humiliated me into silence. The humiliation burned, but underneath the shame was something else, something sharper. They thought this would break me, but they had no idea what was coming. People say the holidays bring families together. For me, it was always the season when I was reminded just how far apart we really were. I wasn't lazy. In fact, I worked harder than most of my siblings. I took shifts at the hardware store 6 days a week, helped neighbors mow their lawns, even fixed Mrs. Givens's leaky roof one summer just because she didn't have the money to call a contractor. My hands were always covered in splinters, calluses, or paint. But in my father's eyes, none of that mattered. To him, the only effort worth acknowledging was the kind he approved of, his kind. He admired my older brother Daniel, who followed in his footsteps and joined his construction business. He boasted about my younger sister Emily, who was still in college but full of promise. As for me, I was the drifter, the dreamer, the one who hadn't made him proud. It didn't matter that I paid rent on time, kept the house repaired, or that half the groceries in the pantry came from my paycheck. In his mind, I was nothing but an expense. The first sting came years before that Christmas dinner. I'd saved for months to buy a second-hand laptop. Not for games, not for fun, but because I wanted to take online courses in graphic design. I'd hidden away tips, overtime pay, and every crumpled dollar I earned fixing lawnmowers and painting fences. The night I brought it home, proud, my father scoffed. "Why waste money on that junk? You'll never make a living staring at a screen." He didn't even look at me when he said it. Just shook his head and turned back to Daniel, asking how many new contracts he'd landed at work. It was small, but it cut deep. That laptop became more than just a tool. It was a reminder, proof that I had to carve my own path, whether or not he approved. Still, I swallowed it. I told myself he'd come around, that if I worked hard enough, showed him results, maybe one day I'd hear the words, "I'm proud of you." But pride never came. Instead, the humiliations grew sharper. At birthdays, he'd toast Daniel's accomplishments. At church, he'd brag about Emily's grades, and when people asked about me, he'd laugh and change the subject. "Still figuring things out," he'd say, the corners of his mouth curling in that same smug grin I'd later see at Christmas. The neighbors noticed too. Once, after I patched up Mr. Klein's garage door, he said, "Your dad should be proud. You've got a good head on your shoulders." I just smiled weakly, because I knew the truth. Inside my own home, I'd never be more than the family disappointment. And yet, I stayed. Why? Because leaving felt impossible. I was saving, but not enough. I wanted peace, but I thought peace meant enduring, keeping quiet, avoiding conflict. I told myself it was better to be the punching bag than to set off another explosion. But with every insult, every smirk, every stolen moment of pride, the weight pressed heavier on my chest. My nights grew restless. I'd stare at the ceiling long after midnight, the laptop humming softly at my desk, my future pixelated on the glowing screen, still out of reach. And then came Christmas. The house decked in gold garlands, candles flickering on the mantel, the smell of pine and nutmeg sweet in the air. To everyone else, it was warmth and family. To me, it was a stage, a place where I knew my father would play his favorite role, the man in control. I thought I was prepared for his usual digs. But nothing prepared me for the moment he decided to strip away the last shred of dignity I had left, in front of every pair of eyes that mattered. And as I sat frozen under that chandelier, napkin clenched tight in my hands, I realized this was no longer about surviving his insults. This was the beginning of something bigger, something neither of us could take back. After that Christmas dinner, the house changed. Or maybe it had always been that way, and I was only just seeing it clearly. The silence was worse than the words. My father didn't repeat his Leech comment out loud, but his looks did the talking. A raised eyebrow when I poured myself coffee. A scoff when he passed by my half-open laptop at the dining table. His contempt lived in the air we breathed, and the others followed his lead. Daniel avoided me entirely, his booming laugh suddenly quieter whenever I entered the room. Emily looked at me with a kind of awkward pity, but she didn't speak up. My mother kept herself busy, bustling in the kitchen, wiping down already clean counters. Her silence hurt most of all. She didn't agree with him. I could see it in the way she flinched when he cut me down, but she never defended me either. Neighbors heard the story too. My father had a way of making himself the victim, retelling Christmas dinner like it was his moment of tough love. He just needs to grow up, I overheard him telling Mr. Klein one Saturday morning. I can't carry him forever. A man should stand on his own feet. The sting was sharp, because he left out the part where I was standing. Paying rent, buying groceries, fixing leaks, splitting firewood. He twisted the truth until even people outside the house looked at me differently. It started to wear me down. I'd lie awake at night, the ceiling fan spinning shadows across my room. My chest tightened until it felt like something heavy sat on it. I kept grinding through shifts at the hardware store, but exhaustion made my hands clumsy. One evening, I dropped a box of nails, and the sharp clatter on the floor made me want to sink to my knees and not get back up. I didn't tell anyone. I carried the weight alone. Until one night, when I stayed late after work. The store was quiet, aisles neat, and shelves freshly stocked. I was sweeping near the paint section when Mr. Lopez, the night manager, stopped by. He was a quiet man, not one for small talk, but he paused and leaned against the shelf like he had something on his mind. "You okay, kid?" he asked. I shrugged. "Yeah, just tired." He didn't buy it. His dark eyes lingered, reading me like an open book. "You work harder than most people here. Harder than you should, maybe. I see it." I laughed it off, but the sound cracked. "Doesn't feel like it makes much difference." He tilted his head. "Difference to who?" "To your dad." My eyes snapped up, startled. He smiled faintly, like he'd struck a nerve he already knew was there. "I've been there," he said. "Trying to earn respect from someone who never wanted to give it. Feels like running on a treadmill. Exhausting. Going nowhere." Something in me broke open at those words. I hadn't said a single thing about my father, but he'd read the truth in me anyway. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt the tightness in my chest loosen just a little. "Here's the thing," he continued. "People like that, they don't get to decide your worth. You do. Don't forget that I stood there with the broom in my hands, heart pounding, because no one had ever said it to me that plainly before. It wasn't a grand speech. It wasn't a solution. But it was a spark. For the first time, I wasn't completely alone. That night, as I walked home through the cold air, the streetlights stretching shadows across the sidewalk, I repeated his words over and over in my head. They don't get to decide your worth. And for the first time, I started to wonder if I stopped trying to prove myself to them. What would happen if I built a life that proved it to myself? The weeks after New Year's felt like walking through a storm that wouldn't end. My father's words from Christmas weren't just an outburst. They were a declaration of war. He began tightening the screws in ways only he could. First, the money. "Rent's going up," he announced one morning at the kitchen table. He didn't look at me when he said it, just sipped his coffee like it was casual. The number he quoted was double what I'd been paying. I stared at him. "That's half my paycheck." "Then get a better job." he replied, eyes cold. Or get out. It was a trap, and we both knew it. He wanted me desperate. He wanted me gone. Me. Next came the smear campaigns. At church, I overheard whispers. One woman leaned over to another and murmured, "Heard he still can't hold down a decent job." Living off his dad, I froze, heat burning my face. My father's voice carried across the room, booming with exaggerated sorrow. "I've tried everything to set him straight, but some kids just won't learn responsibility." And the people nodded, believed him. Why wouldn't they? He wore his authority like armor, polished and untouchable. The pressure mounted until even the house itself turned hostile. My father began locking the fridge at night, claiming groceries weren't free. He shut off the Wi-Fi during my online classes, saying, "If you want internet, pay for your own." My sister tiptoed around me. My mother kept her lips pressed shut, and Daniel laughed outright whenever he saw me struggling. Every step I took felt like quicksand pulling me down. But then, something shifted. One night, after my father cut the Wi-Fi again, I packed up my laptop and headed to the library. It was late, the fluorescent lights humming above, the smell of dust and old paper thick in the air. I sat up at a corner table and opened my files. And there it was, the thing I'd been quietly building, piece by piece, for months. Logos, posters, digital designs I'd made for local businesses who couldn't afford real agencies. A cafe menu I'd designed for Mrs. Rodriguez down the street. A flyer for the church bake sale, even though no one knew it was mine. My folder wasn't just coursework, it was a portfolio. Proof that my junk laptop wasn't junk at all. It was the foundation of a career. For the first time in weeks, I felt the scales shift, even if only slightly. My father thought he was cutting off my future by pulling the plug on the Wi-Fi. But he had no idea I'd already started building something beyond his control. And I wasn't completely alone anymore. Mr. Lopez from work kept checking in. He'd slip me extra shifts, sometimes slide me a sandwich when I skipped dinner. And at the library, I met Anna, an old classmate who'd graduated college and now freelanced as a designer. She noticed my screen one evening and leaned over. "Did you make that?" she asked, pointing at a cafe logo I was polishing. "Yeah," I said, embarrassed. "Just for practice." Her eyebrows shot up. "Practice? That's solid work. You could get clients with that." The words hit me like a lifeline. Someone who wasn't family, someone who owed me nothing, saw value in what I created. That night, walking home under the street lamps, my father's shadow no longer felt so suffocating. Because now, I knew something he didn't. He thought I was still trapped, still cornered. But the truth was, I had a skill he couldn't touch, connections he didn't know existed, and proof he couldn't erase. As I shut the door to my room and set my laptop back on the desk, my reflection stared back at me from the black screen. "They thought they still had control," I whispered to myself. "They didn't." And I meant it. By spring, the battle lines were drawn. My father no longer tried to hide his contempt. He flaunted it. He whispered poison into every ear he could find. At the hardware store, a regular customer, Mrs. Jenkins, frowned when she saw me behind the counter. "Your father says you've been slacking off." "That true?" Slacking off. I nearly laughed. My hands were raw from carrying lumber. My back ached from unloading pallets, and I hadn't called in sick once all year. But his words traveled faster than my truth ever could. It was the same everywhere. At church, neighbors greeted me with tight smiles, as though they already knew I was destined to fail. Even Emily pulled back further, avoiding me at family dinners, afraid that defending me would cost her my father's approval. The isolation pressed in from all sides. And yet, something inside me had shifted since that night at the library. Instead of letting his lies crush me, I started documenting everything. Every receipt for groceries I bought, every utility bill I paid, every text message where he threatened to kick me out or raised my rent without warning. I kept them all in a neat folder on my laptop, backed up on a flash drive I hid under my mattress. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was strategy. And while he spread rumors, I built. With Anna's encouragement, I started freelancing quietly on the side. Small projects at first, logos, flyers, simple websites. The money wasn't much, but every payment felt like proof that I wasn't worthless, no matter what he said. One night, Anna looked at me across the library table, her eyes steady. You know, if you keep at this, you could move out. Sooner than you think. The idea lodged itself in my chest like a spark catching flame, moving out. My father wanted me gone, but not like that. He wanted me broken, crawling away in shame. What if I left on my own terms? What if I walked out stronger than when I came in? Meanwhile, the cracks in his armor were starting to show. Daniel's construction contracts weren't going as well as my father bragged. I overheard them arguing in the garage one night. Voices low but sharp. Daniel needed a loan. My father didn't have as much money as he let on, and when he realized I was no longer cowed by his threats, his rage doubled. He began storming into my room unannounced, tossing my belongings onto the floor, sneering at my designs. "Worthless doodles," he spat one night, knocking my sketchbook off the desk. But this time I didn't flinch. I calmly picked it up, set it back in place, and looked him in the eye. "Keep laughing," I said softly. "You won't be laughing forever." The look on his face, confusion, then fury, was worth every sleepless night. For once, he saw it, that I wasn't scared anymore. From that moment on, I worked like a soldier preparing for battle. Every paycheck, I tucked away savings. Every design I finished, I added to my portfolio. Every rumor he spread, I countered with quiet proof. Neighbors who saw me fixing fences, customers who praised my work, small businesses who came back for repeat designs. The symbolic object, the laptop he mocked, became my weapon. Each click, each file saved, was a brick in the fortress I was building. And though my father still strutted through the house like a king untouchable, I knew the truth. His empire was crumbling, brick by brick, even if he didn't see it yet. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was preparing. The showdown came sooner than I expected. It was a humid Saturday in June, the air thick with the smell of cut grass and barbecue drifting from neighbors' yards. My father had gathered the family for what he called a house meeting. I already knew what it was about. When I walked into the living room, he was sitting in his armchair like a judge on his throne. Daniel leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his smirk already in place. Emily sat nervously on the edge of the sofa, twisting her hands in her lap. My mother hovered by the doorway, her eyes darting between us like she wanted to disappear. My father didn't waste time. "This can't go on," he declared, his voice booming. "You're draining this family dry." "You don't contribute enough. You disrespect this house, and frankly, you're a disgrace." I stayed silent. I wanted him to spill it all out. "You've got 2 weeks," he continued. 2 weeks to get out, and don't come crawling back. I've already told the neighbors. You're on your own now." He leaned back, satisfied, waiting for me to break. But this time, I wasn't the one cornered. Slowly, I pulled the flash drive from my pocket and set it on the coffee table. "You've been telling everyone I'm a burden," I said evenly. "But let's look at the truth." I plugged it into the TV's USB port. The screen flickered, and then my folder opened. Receipts filled the screen. Grocery bills with my card number, utility payments in my name, rent transfers I'd made every month for 2 years. One by one, the evidence stacked against him. The room went dead silent. "That's not all," I said, my voice calm but sharp. I clicked again, and up popped my portfolio. Logos, flyers, websites, each stamped with client confirmations and payments. "While you've been telling everyone I'm worthless, I've been building something you couldn't control. These are contracts. Real clients, real money. And unlike you, I don't need to lie about it." My father's face darkened, his jaw twitching. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Emily's eyes widened. My mother brought a hand to her mouth. "You think this makes you better than me?" my father spat. No, I said, meeting his glare. It proves you were wrong. I let the words hang in the air. For the first time, he didn't have a comeback. His hands trembled on the armrest. The authority he wore like armor was cracking, the mask slipping in front of the very family he'd turned against me. I stepped closer, my voice steady. You've called me a leech, a failure, a disgrace, but here's the truth. You needed me more than I ever needed you. I kept this house running, I paid bills you never mentioned, and when you tried to destroy me, I built something stronger out of the ashes. The silence was thick. Even the clock on the wall seemed to hold its breath. Finally, I straightened. I don't want apologies, I said, my voice clear. I want change. And with that, I picked up the flash drive, slipped it back into my pocket, and turned toward the door. The weight on my chest, the years of humiliation, of being small under his shadow, lifted. I didn't need to win him over. I didn't need his approval. I was already free. Behind me, I heard my father's voice crack, a sound I'd never heard from him before. But I didn't turn back. The empire he built on control and lies had finally collapsed. And I was walking into something bigger. The door clicked shut behind me that day, and with it, something inside me shifted forever. I hadn't stormed out in anger. I hadn't begged. I had simply walked away, and that choice alone was more powerful than any insult my father had ever hurled. I crashed at Mrs. Rodriguez's spare room for a few weeks. She ran a small outreach program for people trying to get on their feet, and when she heard what happened, she didn't hesitate. The apartment was tiny, with peeling wallpaper and a mattress that sagged in the middle. But when I laid down that first night, the silence wasn't suffocating. It was peaceful. And that laptop, the same one my father had mocked, sat on the desk by the window, glowing like a beacon in the dark. From that little room, my world began to expand. Anna helped me refine my portfolio, showing me how to pitch myself to clients online. Within weeks, I landed steady work, logo packages for startups, social media graphics for local shops, even a website redesign for a realtor. The payments weren't huge, but they added up. More importantly, they were mine. Every dollar earned outside of my father's shadow felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. I bought a small corkboard and pinned each completed project to it. By the end of the summer, the board was nearly full. Proof that I wasn't drifting anymore. I was building. Meanwhile, my father's image in the community began to crack. At first, people believed his version of events, that he'd finally cut off the leech. But when neighbors noticed he couldn't fix his own gutters without calling someone, or when Daniel's construction jobs fell through, whispers began. One Sunday, I ran into Mr. Klein at the grocery store. He studied me for a moment, then said, "Funny, your dad told me you'd never last outside his house. But you look happier." I smiled. I am. The tide was turning. And then came the moment of quiet satisfaction. A text from Emily. "I'm sorry I didn't speak up. You were right. He treats us all like pawns. I wish I'd had your courage." I stared at the message for a long time, the knot in my chest loosening just a little more. She wasn't ready to break away, but she saw the truth now. Seeds had been planted. By the end of the year, I'd saved enough to move into my own apartment. It wasn't fancy, a one-bedroom with squeaky floors and water-stained walls, but it was mine. I hung my corkboard above the desk, added new pins with each client, and even framed one of my first paychecks as a reminder. The symbolic object, the laptop, no longer felt like a fragile dream. It was my anchor, my weapon, my proof. Sometimes, late at night, I'd think back to that Christmas dinner. The chandelier glittering, the silverware clinking, my father's voice cutting me down in front of everyone. And I'd smile, because I could still hear my own voice rising over his in the end. I don't want apologies. I want change. I didn't know if he ever changed. Maybe he never would. But I had. The humiliation that once felt like a death sentence had become the push I needed to claim my life. This wasn't the end. If you've made it this far, Maybe you've lived something like this too. Maybe you felt the sting of favoritism, the weight of betrayal, or the crushing silence of someone trying to erase your worth. I want you to hear me clearly. Their opinion doesn't define you. Their approval isn't the gate to your future. Have you ever faced a parent, a boss, or a so-called friend who tried to make you small? How did you rise above it? Share it below. I promise someone else needs to read your story, because worth isn't something they hand you. It's something you claim for yourself.